thank you for joining us for this Wednesday evening service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. I hope that you will think about attending one of the services of our church. Presently, we have 3 in-person services, one at 8:30 on Sunday morning, one at 9:45, and one at 11 o'clock. And we would love to have you attend one of those services. Today, I would like to begin a study, a 4-part study of the parable of the prodigal. And the title of it is Exploring Who You Are and Who You're to Become. It's a story most of you know well. You know the characters and you know their character, but perhaps what you don't know is which one of those characters is you. You may have an idea even as I speak, but I think the thing that will surprise you is to discover which one of those characters you should become. I'm going to begin by reading the first few verses of that parable. It comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. I'm going to read verses 11 through 16. And he said, "There was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them. Not many days after, the younger son gathered all that he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property with reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything." There it is, the first part of that parable. I think one of our problems is that often the stories of our Bible become so familiar to us that we hardly give a second thought to the details. We see the big picture, but not the many small pictures along the way. So this evening, I want us to think about the 2 sons who lived in this home. And I have already raised the question, which one are you? But tonight, I want us to focus on the younger son specifically and on his departure. Now, the most obvious part of this story, and here is number 1, is that he was a son. That part of the story can't be explained away by where he went or what he did or even by what led him to do such things. He was a son when the story began. He was a son in the father's house, and then he was a son in the far country, and he was a son when he returned. Are you? I think that's a significant question, because we're thinking about whether or not you are a child of God. Some of you might say, well, I think I am, but, or I was, but, or I used to be, and then. Hopefully, before we're finished with part 1 of the study, you'll have an answer to that question. But the young man in this story was a son. Second, he was a hungry son in the father's house. We read that into the story. We don't know why. There was no reason it should have been the case, but being a son in the father's house was just simply not enough for him. He was hungry for adventure. He took a journey. For this younger son, it was a journey away from the father. Have you ever made a journey like that? Are you on one now? He was hungry for the world. But the Bible tells us to love not the world, neither the things of the world. And it tells us that if any man loves the world, the love of the Father, or in this case, love for the Father, is not in him. There was a hunger in him for something other than what the Father could or did give up to that moment. He was hungry for love. Did the Father love him? Well, yes. He was not unloved in the Father's house, but he was hungry for a love other than that of the Father. Did he find it? Did it satisfy? Perhaps we can best answer that by considering how satisfying it's been for you. Are you looking for something outside the Father's house and outside the Father's love? Have you found it? Did it satisfy? Or are you still a hungry child in the Father's house? He was hungry for blessings. However unidentified they might be, he wanted blessings when all the while his Father was the blessing. He wanted provisions when all the while his Father was the provider. He was also hungry for intimacy. He sought that intimacy in sinful relationships. His experience with relationships in the far country, however, left him lonely and empty. The arms that longed to hold him had always been those of the Father, arms that he rejected, but interestingly in the story, never rejected him. He was hungry for independence. He was a man after all. He wanted to be his own man and free of the Father's control. He didn't want to be a slave in the Father's house. He wanted to be free. He was hungry for all of these things because, number 3, he was a selfish and self-centered son. We see that in verse 12, when with a cold and uncaring heart, he approached the Father and said, "Father, give me the share of the property that is coming to me." His main request and his main concern was that the Father give. He gave no thought to anyone but himself. He gave no thought to what it would cost the Father to give it, or how hard the Father worked to earn it, or how it might impact his elder brother who still lived in the Father's house. This young man had plans after all. He wanted to consume the blessings provided by his Father on his own lust. No longer would he live his life based on what the Father wanted for him, but based on what he wanted for himself. So he was a son, but he was a hungry son in the Father's house. And number 3, he was a selfish and self-centered son. Number 4, he was a desperate son. As you see in the story, he wasted no time. Not many days later, once he had what he wanted, or once what he considered was his was in his hand, he gathered all that he had and he took a journey into a far country. You see, he wanted the Father's blessings more than he wanted the Father's presence and a relationship with the Father. Do you know how that feels? Have you ever had a son or a daughter come to you and make you feel like they were just waiting for you to get out of the way so that they could have what was coming to them? Or worse, has a child ever reached out to you for a blessing and then turned his or her back on you in ingratitude? Only a parent can know the pain that pierced this father's heart. He was desperate to be away from his father. That was his desperate desire. Not only was he a desperate son, number 5, he was a materialistic son. The Bible says he gathered it all together, or in the story as Jesus tells it, he gathered it all together. He added up the sum total, pondered how far it might take him, planned his trip, parted from his father and from his brother. He left willfully, arrogantly, and shamelessly. He took his journey. He took it alone. He was interested in possessions that he could gather from that home and not the people, not the relationships. People were not important. Possessions were important. His things would buy him everything he needed and provide him everything he wanted. So he took his journey, this son, this hungry son in the Father's house, this selfish and self-centered son, this materialistic son. Not only so, he was a simple-minded son. He went on a journey without the Father. He considered himself wiser and better able to manage his own resources, his own life, better able to plan his own life journey rather than trusting in the Father's leadership and in the Father's love. So he went on his journey alone. He didn't need the wisdom of the Father or the Father's guidance. Most of all, he didn't need the Father. He went into a far country. And by the way, The far country is the inevitable destination of a son who travels without the father. The far country is distant from the father's house, distant from the father's presence, distant from the father's blessing, but never distant from the father's love. Number 7, he was a wasteful son. As we read in the story, he squandered his estate. He threw away all the blessings that his father gave him. He had no sense of the magnitude of what he'd been given, or with the money in his pocket, the shoes on his feet, the robe on his back, a ring on his finger, did not have the magnitude of what he lost when he left the Father. Have you pondered that in your own life? How long ago was it when you left the Father's presence to sojourn in a far country of your own? You may be living distant from the Father. You may be yet to have a sense of the magnitude of what you've lost by living distant from the Father. Right now, you feel like you have everything that you need. But one of the things that always happens in the far country, distant from the Father, sooner or later, a famine comes into that person's life. Number 8, he was an immoral son. The Bible says he practiced loose living or reckless living. Some translations read riotous living, prodigal living, foolish living. No doubt it was shameful living. These things he would never have done in the presence of the Father. But outside the Father's sight, he could do as he pleased, be what he pleased, experienced what he pleased. He had no concern for his own reputation, for the reputation of his family, most of all, for the reputation of his father. But now he was also, and ultimately, as a result of his journey, number 9, he was a spent son. Think with me about all the ways he was spent. First, he was spent financially. He lost everything the Father gave him. His resources were gone. He had nothing. Second, he was spent morally. Loose living, foolish living, wild living, shameful living was not living after all. He was dying inside. He was spent morally, and as a result, he was mentally, emotionally exhausted. Next, he was spent physically. He was hungry, he was empty, he was lonely, he was tired, and he was on rock bottom. But he was also spent spiritually. He was distant from his Father in that distant country. But the picture that Jesus is trying to paint for us by telling us this parable is the picture of a man who was distant from God. The delight of the distant country became a dreadful famine. The Bible says he began to be impoverished. He began to be in need. But if you'll notice, the beginning he began was only the start. He was yet to plumb the depths of his own emptiness. So what does a man do when he begins to feel his own personal emptiness? Well, he begins to take steps to meet his own need. And that's what this boy did. Consider with me verses 15 and 16 again. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed the pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. You see, the steps that he took to meet his own need only took him deeper into the far country and took him farther away from the Father. With each step away from the Father, an increasing severity of personal emptiness came into his life. Eventually, he hit rock bottom, and he was ready to eat with the pigs. But no one that he had come to know in that far country was giving him anything. The only one who ever gave him anything was the Father. I want to ask you, do you know anyone like that? Have I just taken the last few minutes to describe you? Are you that younger son in the far country? Are you the pastor in the far country? Are you the deacon in a far country? Are you the young wife in the far country? Are you a lonely widow in the far country? Do you find yourself spent and in need? Allow me to remind you of one of the characteristics of this boy that we need to remember. He was a son in a father's house when he left. When he spent all in the far country, when he was financially spent and morally spent and emotionally spent and physically spent and spiritually spent, he was still a son. Still a son. There's more to this story, and we're going to look at it next week. But I do hope that you sense that the Father who loved you before you perhaps left for the far country loves you still today. He cares about you, and He wants you to come home. Next week, we'll consider the return of the prodigal. I hope as we continue that you find yourself in this story, but most of all, that you find out who you should become. I want to thank you so much for listening.